And by comparison, this new style of slam is very safe, very accessible, just not interesting to me at all. It's like non-alcoholic vodka. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and welcome back to my What Killed the Genre series, where I usually look at genres that have fallen off in terms of commercial popularity, and I try to figure out what happened. But this one is going to be a little bit different because I'm here to talk about a genre that basically never had any commercial success and still doesn't, and that is slam. And if you're not familiar with slam, basically what that means is bands that sound like this or this. Slam is actually more popular than ever, where popular means that it has like a solid, engaged underground following, but at the expense of everything that made me love slam in the first place. Basically, what I hear a lot of people call slam these days is very clean, safe, sterile stuff that sounds much more like deathcore or death metal than what I would have ever thought of as slam. And yes, this is me being a slam hipster. I'm very aware of this. This is me being like the real emo people who say My Chemical Romance ruined everything, and that stuff you guys listen to now isn't real emo. Why don't you go listen to some Cap'n Jazz and Braid, modern baseball? And one quick note, there's unfortunately a lot of misogynist stuff in this genre, which I really can't stand. And I want to be super clear that I definitely do not support any of that. So if there's a band that you don't hear me mention and you're wondering why, that could be the reason. So I don't know, call me an SJW if you want, but that's how I feel. Before I get into it, I want to quickly plug my Instagram. I've been posting a whole lot more on there lately, so if you like this video or any of my other videos, I would love it if you give me a follow over there. There's a link in the description. And one last note, I want to give a shout out to Brad Fincher from Devourment for helping me brainstorm and fact check some of this. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, the Liege of Inveracity riff. Ever since I first discovered metal and hardcore back when I bought the Suicidal Tendencies Lights Camera Revolution album, I was always looking for something more extreme. Something heavier, faster, more brutal, more aggressive, just anything that was more extreme. And this was the early 90s when obviously we didn't have streaming, so discovering new bands or genres was mostly trial and error. You'd basically buy an album based on a hunch because you heard their name mentioned in an interview or in the thanks list on an album you like, or maybe you saw the sticker on someone's guitar, or maybe just because they had a cool name or cover art. And I discovered some great bands like Sepultura, The Accused, Morbid Angel, tons more. And I loved all those bands, and I still do, but it wasn't until I bought Effigy the Forgotten by Suffocation in I think 93 or 94 that I finally heard it. The sound that was in my head, but I'd never actually heard before. And I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that there was one particular part on that album that changed everything for me, which is this one riff from the song Liege of Inveracity. Pretty slammy, right? As soon as I heard that, I was hooked. I wanted a whole album that sounded like that. No, wait, fuck that. I wanted a whole genre that sounded like that one part. And in fact, if I had to point to one specific moment as the birth of slam, it would be that exact part. Because I think there were thousands of people all over the planet who had the same experience I did and started their own band with the concept behind the band being basically all our songs will sound like that one Suffocation part. And that's why I point to it as the Adam and Eve of slam. Part 2, what exactly is slam? Before I move on, let me plant a stake in the ground and very specifically define what slam means to me. If you have a different idea of it, that's totally cool. Like I said, I'm not trying to force my opinion on anyone. I just want to be super clear about what I'm talking about when I personally say slam in this video. To me, these are the defining elements. First, slam riffs, obviously. I'm talking about those slow, chuggy, palm-muted power chords with lots of chromatic notes and pinch harmonics. For example, second, the vocals. It has to have those ultra guttural, gurgling vocals. For example, there's no highs, there's no growls, and obviously there can be no cleans. And speaking of which, let me also spell out the things that slam does not have in my definition of it. First of all, no skank beats ever. This is a skank beat if you're not sure what I'm talking about. No solos, no sweep picking, and no tremolo riffing, ever. And this, for anybody who's not sure, is a tremolo riff. If the guitarist is doing any of that stuff, it's just death metal, it's not slam. Also, no breakdowns. Don't get me wrong, I love breakdowns as much as the next guy, probably actually a lot more than the next guy, but they aren't slam. And I also love Ariana Grande, but she isn't slam either. And lastly, although not, I guess, strictly a requirement, to me, slam is also defined by two more things. First, the production, which I guess we could charitably call raw, but I think most people would just call awful. And I guess objectively speaking, it is awful, but awful in a way that sounds great to me for the genre. For example, I think this sounds fucking great. And last but definitely not least, the ringy cranked snares. For example, again, this is my admittedly super specific definition of the genre, and feel free to disagree, but now that we all know exactly what I'm talking about when I say slam in this video, let's move on and talk about how it came to be. Part 3, Proto-slam, from roughly 1991 to 1995. Like I said, although Suffocation were definitely the best known band playing this style in the early 90s, they certainly weren't the only ones. So first of all, along with Suffocation, there are a handful of bands from Long Island doing roughly that same kind of style, and I was very into that New York death metal sound because back then it had that bouncy, slamming kind of groove that really nobody else was doing until true slam came along. The most notable bands in that kind of scene, in my opinion, are Internal Bleeding, and Pyrexia. And if you're into this sound, there's a bunch of other proto-slam New York death metal bands of that era you might want to check out, such as Skinless, Baphomet, Afterbirth, and Dehumanized, among many others. This scene had so many great bands in the 90s. And of course, I also have to mention Dying Fetus, who had some very slammy parts like this one from their 93 demo. And lastly, Disgorge from San Diego, who are so ahead of their time. I mean, listen to this, and keep in mind, this is from 1992, a quarter of a century ago. So there were all these bands in the early to mid 90s flirting with slam that had some slam parts here and there, but it wasn't until the late 90s that what I would call true slam came into existence. Which brings us to part 4, the birth of true slam from roughly 1996 to 2000. Essentially, there were a few bands scattered all over the country who had the same idea that I did of, hey, wait a minute, what if we made a whole band that sounded like that one part in Liege of Inveracity? Only, unlike me, they actually got off their asses and started a band. Repudilation from Long Island were the first band that I heard to do truly pure slam. I remember getting this demo at the, I think, 1997 Ohio Death Fest. Internal Bleeding played that one, and I think their guitarist Chris recommended it to me because I have this really vivid memory of someone saying to me in a super thick Long Island accent, "It's fucking brutal, bro," which it definitely is. And then there was also Deprecated from San Diego, who didn't have the straight up gurgle vocals, but were slamming pretty hard. And you may know their bassist Derek Boyer, who went on to be in Decrepit Birth, Deeds of Flesh, and Suffocation, among many other great bands. This was his first band. I think they were like 17 or 18 when they did this demo, which is pretty amazing. And last but definitely not least, the band that put slam on the map, Devourment. If I was to point to one song that's the template for modern slam, it would be the song Baby Killer from their album 138. This was Slam's first hit single because, I mean, how fucking catchy is this song, right? It maybe wasn't as absurdly brutal as Repudilation, which was just so heavy that it's one small step from straight up noise, but what they gave up in terms of brutality, they made up for with the catchiness. This is like the Hit Me Baby One More Time of Slam. You just kind of can't help but bob your head to it, right? And it actually even kind of has a chorus with a few words you can understand. They put all the elements together into one neat package in a way that nobody else had to date. They laid the blueprint for slam, people from all over the world noticed, and it opened the floodgates for what to me was the golden years of slam. Which brings us to part 5, the golden years from 2001 to maybe 2010. I call these the golden years because for a while there in the mid-2000s, it felt like I was discovering a sick new slam band like every week. I can't list them all, so as I always say in these videos, please don't be the "why didn't you mention this band or that band" guy. But here's just a few of the most notable ones. First of all, there was this whole crop of really fucking good Japanese bands like Gorevent, Vomit Remnants, Rest and Gore, and my personal favorites, Disconformity. And over in Europe, there are quite a few great bands as well, some of which I'm not going to name because they get a little bit too misogynist, but definitely check out Defeated Sanity as one example of this, especially their album Psalms of the Moribund from 2007, which is just premium slam. And speaking of Europe, of course I have to mention Epicardiectomy, who got a lot of attention for their Mountains of Death video. If you've ever heard the "let me see some hammers" meme in the comments or whatever of a slam video, it's from this video, and I would definitely recommend you watch this whole thing because it is just amazing. Bordering on unintentional performance art. And then there's all the Russian stuff like Katalepsy and Abominable Putridity. Now, I want to pause really quickly to highlight something. You'll notice that this Russian stuff sounds a lot cleaner, a lot more death metal than the other stuff I played. That is why I personally didn't like it as much, but more importantly, I want you to just make a little mental note of that, file it away, because I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But in my opinion, there were two bands that really stood out as the cream of the crop of the new wave of slam. First, Cephalotripsy's 2007 album, which I absolutely fell in love with. This is a really interesting album to me because it goes beyond even quote-unquote brutal. It's so over the top that it goes into this like weird parallel dimension that's almost like avant-garde art music or something. And here's what it sounds like if you haven't heard it. Hold on a minute. Can we just take a minute to talk about that Cephalotripsy snare? That is like the perfect slam snare. I love that snare so much. My friends at Toontrack, please, for the love of God, make a slam library for Superior Drummer. And that library, all it needs to have in it, it needs to have a kick drum, it needs to have that snare, and maybe like 7 or 8 chinas and ice bells. And second, in my opinion, the single best release of the whole new wave of slam, Cerebral Incubation's second full length from 2012. I could tell you why it's so good, or I could just play a clip and it should be obvious to you. Basically, it's like Cephalotripsy on meth. It's that same putrid, ultra-guttural vocal style, and oh my god, the guitar tone. I don't think anybody will ever beat this in terms of that super scooped jun-jun kind of sound. It's just perfection. Which brings me to part number 6, why slam was special and interesting. If you've ever heard interviews of the early black metal guys, you probably remember them talking about how death metal had become boring to them because it was overproduced, because it emphasized quote-unquote being technical, that it had lost the edge and aggression that it once had, and that the rawness of black metal was a reaction to that. Now, I'm not a huge black metal fan, and I actually do like a lot of the modern death metal that those guys didn't, but I kind of agree with them. There was a massive glut of generic, formulaic death metals in the 90s and 2000s that was boring and, well, just not heavy. And what really turned me off to the whole genre of death metal for a long time was the melodic death metal mega trend that started in the late 90s. It was way too clean and non-threatening, and just, to me, the whole idea of melodic death metal at all is a total oxymoron. To me, melodic death metal is like saying non-alcoholic vodka. It just makes no sense. Like, those two things don't belong together. What it comes down to is that slam appealed to me for all the same reasons that early black metal was appealing to other people. Because it was raw and nasty with the aggression progression of hardcore, but with the heaviness and speed of death metal. To me, it was the exact opposite of melodeath, where that stuff was so accessible and friendly that people who didn't normally fuck with death metal at all were getting into it. For example, all the guys who went on to start the metalcore bands of the 2000s, slam was so out there that even metal fans hated it. And just to make this contrast super clear, let's compare this to this. And I don't know, maybe this makes me a hipster, but as I've said in some of my other videos, if a new art movement comes along that the established artists hate and talk shit on, I'm always interested, because that usually means they're doing something unique and interesting and innovative that years later we'll look back on as being really significant. But as always, the brightest flames burn out quickly, and that was the case here too. That nasty, raw slam that I loved started to be a lot less common, and the genre began to turn into something much closer to deathcore or brutal death metal. Which brings us to part 7, watering it down. A few minutes ago, I mentioned the Russian bands like Katalepsy that were referred to as slam, but to me were cut from a different cloth. They had noticeably cleaner production than the rest of the genre, the drums are programmed and sounded like your standard quote-unquote metal drums, and their vocals are often more on the death metal or deathcore growl side of things than the ultra guttural gurgles of the true slam bands. I noticed that this style was getting a lot more traction than anything else in the slam genre, especially with the deathcore and metalcore kids, and of course I totally understand why. It addressed the two most common complaints with slam, which are the vocals and the production. And really, it wasn't that different from Carnifex or Whitechapel, just with more slam riffs and less breakdowns. But the specific moment where I think slam started to become corified is when Waking the Cadaver went semi-viral with the misheard lyric video for that one song that I'm not going to name, but you probably know the song I'm talking about. This one. The hardcore and deathcore kids love this, and of course I completely understand why, even though I personally think that Waking the Cadaver are absolutely terrible. It had all the stuff they were familiar with, like inhales and tremolo riffs and breakdowns, but it also had some admittedly pretty sweet slam parts, and even a funny video that they could share with their other friends from middle school on MySpace. And that was the genesis of the slamcore subgenre, which is basically deathcore bands throwing in some slam riffs, with Ingested being maybe the best example. To me, it's way too clean, with the sample replaced inhuman drums, everything edited perfectly to the grid, the slick, polished production and the deathcore vocals, and a lot closer to what I thought was the boring, generic death metal of the late 90s and early 2000s. And the bands that didn't go in the slamcore direction went in the brutal death metal direction, with non-slam stuff like breeze, tremolo riffs, and skank beats creeping back in, and only a few slam riffs here and there to make it really at all slam. And there's zillions and zillions of these bands. Vulvodynia is a big one, but probably the best example of it to me is Extermination, Dismemberment. And if you like this stuff, there's easily a few hundred more bands like this on the Slam Worldwide channel, so check that out. And also, props to them for just tirelessly promoting the genre for years and years and years. He's done a lot for Slam. But to me, this style is just so sterile and lifeless, especially if you compare it to like Cerebral Incubation or early Devourment, where it just has that raw energy and aggression. It feels like they're just barely holding it together. And I'm sure if you took that session into Pro Tools or whatever and you looked, it's just not even close to on the grid. And by comparison, this new style of slam is very safe, very accessible, just not interesting to me at all. It's like non-alcoholic vodka. Which brings us to part 8, present day. To be honest, slam is almost certainly more popular than ever. It's just changed form in a way that I personally don't care for. So though slam may not officially be dead, in my eyes it's dead, at least creatively. So I could end this video by saying that it was ruined by all the new bands that didn't do it right, and things were better back in my day, and blah 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 blah. But as you should know by now, if you've watched any of my other videos, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be the guy to say that it sucks because it's different from how it was 10 or 15 years ago, especially because I'm probably one of like 5 people who actually liked it better, when all the recordings sound like shit and the snares sounded like they were sampled from Saint Anger. So instead of doing that, instead of being that guy, I am going to choose to look at this in another light. Instead of being upset that new bands came along and changed it, I'm going to be stoked that slam has finally gotten the attention that it deserved. It's never going to be a commercial genre genre, obviously, but it's definitely bigger than it ever has been, bigger than I ever thought it could be. I would rather be stoked on how fun and exciting the prime years of the genre were and recognize its biggest contribution to the world of metal and hardcore, which is the slam riff. Because let's be real, even if that's the only thing slam gave to the world, that's a pretty fucking solid legacy, right? Because there are very, very few things in this life better than a great slam riff. Alright guys, there you have it. Those are my thoughts on what killed slam, or more accurately, how the genre changed over time, because like I said, it's actually more popular than ever. It's just changed into something that to me no longer feels like slam, but you know, I'm already starting to sound like an old man screaming at the cloud, so I should probably just quit while I'm ahead. And I should turn it over to you guys. Let me know what you think in the comments. What do you think about the difference between that old slam and the new stuff? I would suspect that most of you guys probably think the old stuff just sounds like shit and I'm insane for thinking it was better, but I don't know, you tell me. I want to know what you guys think. What are some exciting new bands that I should check out? Are there any current bands who are doing that older school style of slam that I might like? Let me know in the comments. And like I said, if you like this video or any of my other videos, I'd love it if you give me a follow over on Instagram. There's a link to that in the description. Also, I did make a Spotify playlist for this video. There's a link in the description to that as well, but unfortunately most of this stuff is not on Spotify, so it's a little sparse, but I did the best I could. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.